1776. Think about that.
Yeah, and there was a famous song, A Resolution of Independency, which a lot of people back then said independency, not just independence. And Richard Henry Lee sings this whole song. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track here. But anyway, listener, 1776, classic. You got to watch it. All right, so again, Richard Henry Lee, not to be confused with another Henry Lee that we'll talk about later. So the Congress votes that they want independence. It's at least a resolution. It's not a formal declaration, but that's coming. Congress formed committees to devise a plan for a confederation of the states, and another committee to seek out foreign alliances, and finally, a third committee to write a formal Declaration of Independence. And it's kind of funny, Scott, because we emphasize the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is practically, it's like political scripture. You know, it's like a sacred text in American law, jurisprudence, and American history. But at the time, this committee was considered the least important of these three. The first committee to devise a plan for a confederation, that's the committee that ends up writing the Articles of Confederation, which is our first constitution. And a lot of people have never even heard of that. We'll touch on that in the future. But they thought, well, that's the most important because that's going to give the rules of how the government's going to work, the federal government. The second committee to seek out foreign alliances, that was seen as critical because everybody knew that it was going to be next to impossible to defeat Britain without some serious help from possibly France, possibly Spain, the Netherlands, or maybe all the above. And this third committee, they're just writing a document. You know, they're going to explain why America is doing this. But again, we know this one the best of all. The committee had 5 people. They had Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. Those two are not going to be as famous. They're going to go into state politics. But the committee also had Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson was selected to write the Declaration. Actually, he's going to actually write the first draft. There's a lot of stories about why. Supposedly, John Adams told him, "You're a better writer than me. You're from Virginia, which is a critical colony. And I'm obnoxious and nobody likes me," basically, which there was some truth in that. But
he's very self-aware. The hatchet men of Thomas Jefferson in the 1800 presidential election will bear out. There's wonderful lines about John Adams that he is a hermaphroditic character that has neither the tenderness of a woman nor the firmness of a man.
Yeah, that was, oh man. Yeah, right now, Adams and Jefferson are friends, but that's going to go by the wayside by the 1790s. Anyway, so Jefferson, he's already written a couple of documents and pamphlets that have become pretty famous throughout the colonies, and everybody knows he's a good writer. He's 33 years old, so he's, I believe, the youngest member of the committee, and definitely one of the youngest delegates to the Congress. So, and I'm thinking about 1776 again, where they show he goes up and locks himself in a room, and nobody knows what's happened to him, and you go in there and there's 100 pieces of paper crumbled up on the floor. I don't know if it went that way, but Jefferson wrote the first draft. He showed it to the others, and they suggested corrections, especially Adams and Franklin. This is dramatized very well in the John Adams miniseries. Again, I highly recommend that. And Scott and I will put together a list of recommended shows and movies and musicals even about the Revolutionary period. There's not as many overall as there are for the Civil War, but there are a few in there, and some of them are quite good. The John Adams miniseries, which came out on HBO, I don't know 10 years ago, maybe. It's been a while. It's one of the best historical miniseries I've ever seen. And they, like, for example, in the first draft, Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And Franklin says, "Sacred, that's a little bit too religious-y sounding. There's too much religiosity in that." So he had him change it. So after consulting with Franklin and Adams, Jefferson makes a few changes, and then he sends it to the entire Congress, and they make a lot of changes. And poor old Jefferson's like, "Oh gosh, enough. This is my baby." Jefferson is probably thinking, I wrote it just like I wanted it, and we're making all these changes, but he very graciously allows the changes to be made. So on July 2nd, not July 4th, on July 2nd, Congress officially voted to declare independence from Great Britain. And so, I mean, really, Scott, our Independence Day technically ought to be July 2nd, but I think if you were to propose that, you would, it would not get very far. John Adams wrote a letter, I believe it was to his wife, Abigail. He said, the second day of July, 1776 will be the most memorable epocha, in other words, the most memorable era or age in the history of America. And I skipped some stuff. He went on to say later, it ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. And so, I mean, that's pretty prophetic, don't you think, Scott? He got the day wrong. The reason, by the way, this is not in the notes, but the reason we celebrate the 4th is because the 4th was the day that the document was approved. Okay, so they approved the final draft with all the changes that everybody made on July 4th. It kind of just made it official, I guess. Made it, if you put it in writing, it's official, right, Scott?
Yeah, and Adams is really prophetic. Several episodes ago, we mentioned that he would drink coffee instead of tea after the Boston Tea Party and all the taxes on tea. He might have said it in jest. Some people think this is actually why Americans drink coffee. It's not the case. There's another thing here. Many moons ago, when I was doing a show called History in 5 Minutes, a person asked me, why do we celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks? Is it something to do with Star Spangled Banner, where we talk about the bombs bursting in air, which evokes the War of 1812? It's really nothing too symbolic. Fireworks were part of the general celebration and pageantry of European and North American life. This goes all the way back to the Renaissance and Italian city-states, when fireworks, which, due to growing trade with the Far East, they come from China. Some are producing them locally. So in any sort of grand fair or grand event, fireworks would be part of it. So sorry, there's nothing terribly symbolic there, but that's why we have fireworks. And America being America, we just took it to its most supersized Ford F-350 end and made it bigger than everyone else.
We don't have to do anything. Okay, so it's not because John Adams commanded it?
Yes, it just sort of happened.
Well, all right then. Why don't we, Scott, narrow down a little bit and focus on some of the actual wording of the Declaration, and let's do a little analysis on it. How does that sound?
I think that's fair. We should give the Declaration its due.
That sounds nerdlicious, doesn't it?
Yes.
I don't normally, when I teach a survey course, and so you don't spend a lot of time on anything, but I spend about half an hour on the actual document, the Declaration itself, because I think it's worthy of some analysis. And anyway, so we're not going to quote the whole thing, but I will quote the beginning part. Some people, if you ask them, how does the Declaration of Independence begin? They would say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. But that's wrong. That's not the very beginning. There's a prologue before that. So this is what Jefferson says in the very beginning. I should say Jefferson and the Congress. He had help, which he didn't really want, but he had it anyway. So the Declaration of Independence opens up like this. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And one thing I like to do when I teach this in class, Scott, is I like to ask a volunteer, okay, how would you rephrase that in more modern language? What exactly is Jefferson saying? And sometimes I get a pretty good answer. He's just saying, I think the first part's pretty self-explanatory. When it becomes necessary for one people to break the connection that they have with another and to become equal and separate, it's fitting and proper and necessary that they actually explain why. He says, declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So Jefferson is saying, well, Okay, world, listen to me, world. We're going to explain to you why we are taking this radical step of splitting off from Great Britain and trying to make ourselves at least separate and equal. It's a memorable and compelling statement of both American independence and the ideas underlying it. And he cast his words as an enlightenment and a Republican statement. When I say Republican, I'm not talking about either of the parties in our history that come to be known as Republican. I mean Republican in the sense of we want a republic rather than a kingdom or a monarchy or a dictatorship or anything like that. We want a republic where you have representative government. And it's also in the vein of the Enlightenment. And he stresses here that independence occurs as a human event in human history, not divine wonders or miracles. Governments are created by people. They're not sent from God. So he's deliberately rejecting the concept of divine right monarchy, which many of the European powers still held to at this point. God save the king and all that, right? The French believe that the King of France was God's given representative, and the kingdom was established by God. Same thing, the British, same thing, others. But since Jefferson is saying that governments do not come from God, they come from people, therefore they can be changed whenever people feel it is necessary. And these ideas come mostly from John Locke. Jefferson was heavily influenced by Locke. Of course, Locke is not the only philosopher that we see echoes of here. There are many others, but I would argue that Locke is the primary influence on Jefferson's thought. I don't want to say he had a copy of Locke open a book right next to him and he's just kind of copying out of it. No, he's not really trying to be original though, and he even admitted that later. But neither is he just copying. He's read so much. He's read Locke and he's read Thomas Hobbes and he's read other political philosophers, and he's putting forth a lot of their ideas in his own words. And by the way, notice that he says here the laws of nature and of nature's God. So this is another Enlightenment idea. The Enlightenment philosophers believed in a God, but it's not necessarily the Christian God. It's not the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's not the eternal second person of the Trinity. It's the God of nature. So
yeah, if you're in the camp of arguing that Jefferson was a deist, then this would be a passage that you would use.
Yeah, and I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit trail, but people like Jefferson, Franklin, Washington, they're all very hard to pin down religiously. I don't really think you can't stick them in, this is a deist, or this is a Unitarian, or this is a Orthodox, small o, a regular Orthodox Christian, a Presbyterian, an Anglican. They don't really fit. But clearly, again, Jefferson is rejecting the idea that God and government go hand in hand. He's saying government is not necessarily a divine thing. And he opens up by saying, within the course of human events, certain events become necessary. So what becomes necessary? Things are inevitable. What events have made independence necessary? So Jefferson appeals to natural rights, and he calls them self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, or in other words, obvious. Clear. There's a universal foundation for human rights. What do you think about that, Scott?
Well, I wish we could understand what it would be like to hear or see these words with fresh eyes at the time that they were written, and how truly radical they were when you're completely rejecting late medieval, early modern forms of government almost in their entirety. And I had a guest on where we talked about utopian communities in America in the 1840s, 1850s. And you've heard about some of these goofy things like farms that don't use draft animals or vegetarian communes, and these usually fail in a year or two. Part of the inspiration is that the American Revolution is successful when they've taken 2,000-year-old ideas of Athenian democracy, dusted them off the bookshelves, somehow launched a revolution, and against all reasonable expectation, made it work. So there were many people who thought, let's try out the Plato's Republic and have a philosopher king. Let's try out Thomas More's Utopia. Let's try out all these different things. I don't want to take for granted how truly radical these ideas are to many people at the time.
Yeah, it really is radical, and it's hard for us to understand that, having lived in this system. We've got over a 200-year history now, but yeah, this is new. This is a clear break with everything else.